Of Health, Mental Health, and Education Committee this morning, and we have great guests. But I'd like to open up the meeting. We do not yet have a quorum, but our first item is informational. It's a report. So we are going to, Mr. Sele, can you read number one?
Sure. Item number one is a presentation of the Los Angeles County Quality of Life Index of the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs by Zev Yaroslavsky, Director of the Los Angeles Initiative, Paul Maslin, Project Director, Fairbanks, Maslin, Mullen, Metz and Associates, and Adam Sonnenschein, Senior Research Associate, FM3 Research.
Thank you, and I'm very, very excited to have reserved to hear a report from the Los Angeles Initiative on their latest research and their findings on health in Los Angeles. If I could have Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky, former supervisor, former city council member, and now director of the Los Angeles Initiative, Paul Maslin, project director, Fairbanks, Maslin, Mullen, Metz and Associates, and Adam Sonnenschein, senior research associate at FM3 Research. And Supervisor Yaroslavsky, I mean, you are a great friend, a mentor, and one of the most influencing people, I think, in the city and the county of Los Angeles. And we thank you for your presence here today. And now you've joined UCLA's Luskin School, and I am so looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could ask Elisa Belenkoff-Katz to also join us up here on the panel, because she did most of the work at my end. So also my former chief of staff, now my partner at the LA Initiative at UCLA. Mr. Chairman, Councilman O'Farrell, thank you for convening this meeting and allowing us to make this presentation. I'll just take a minute to introduce it, and then I'll turn it over to Paul Maslin for his presentation. This is the LA County, the UCLA Luskin LA County Quality of Life Index is going to be an annual survey done of county residents, statistically representative sample of county residents, asking them to assess their own quality of life, not to opine about what the quality of life is in general, but how they are impacted quality of life-wise in their day-to-day lives. And it covered 9 different categories. Paul will get into that in detail. And we had some stunning findings, some surprising findings, and some that I think were intuitive to begin with. The significance of this was in what we learned about homelessness and people's anxiety about homelessness and anxiety about food security as well, and also about how people viewed their quality of life in these 9 different categories. And I think you'll find that interesting. The other significance is that we're going to be doing this, as I said, every year, and we'll be able to compare the numerical findings, because people were asked to, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 to 100, if you will, to rate their quality of life. We'll be able to compare from year to year how people's quality of life, how people view their quality of life as compared with previous years, and we'll be able to look at how they view different aspects of their quality of life as well. So it's a very exciting project. We think it will help inform public policymakers such as yourselves in a more visceral way about what's going on. We read statistics all the time, we read reports all the time, but this is as close as we've come to identifying what's it like on the street. And that was really what we were trying to do, is to give public policymakers and decision makers and staff people an opportunity to see how all of these statistics are manifesting themselves in the real world with real people. So let me turn it over to Paul Maslin and Adam Sonnenschein for their presentation.
Thank you, Supervisor Yaroslavsky. Mr. Chairman, Councilmember O'Farrell, happy to be here today. We're going to try to sort of do this PowerPoint over here on the wall, and everybody can follow as best as possible. As you can see, this is, as the supervisor said, this is going to be an annual event that we do in the county. Briefly talk about the methodology. We did over 1,400 surveys throughout the county. Of those, about 650 in the city. You can see the margin of error is roughly about 2.5% overall, a little under 4% in the margin of error. We used a mix of technologies, both random digit dial telephone surveys, but also online. That's simply a product of what the world is like today and how you we felt is you can best reach people. You need sort of a combination of modes to try to do that. We had most of the interviews done in English, but a certain percentage, obviously, of the Latino interviews were also conducted in Spanish. We weighted the data to match the expected adult population by age, gender, ethnicity, and region. The fundamental way this worked is respondents rated their satisfaction, as the supervisor said, with up to about 40 different aspects of quality of life in 9 basic categories. These were randomized, so people, depending on which random order you were getting, you would conduct and have the questions asked in a certain order that would be different than somebody else. There wouldn't be any effect of the actual questionnaire on the outcomes. We ranked the salience of each aspect within categories and then the salience of the categories against each other, so that part of the way we constructed this index was not only people's general attitudes, but also their views of importance of these specific aspects or specific categories. And then we combined and weighted those to produce an ultimate score. The overall satisfaction score is a 59. That number may mean nothing right now, but in subsequent years, as the supervisor indicated, we will have a benchmark to compare it against, slightly above what the midpoint would have been, which would have been 55 in a 10 to 100 scale. We separated the 9 categories essentially into 3 different groupings, ones that produce positive responses, more neutral, and those that were also negative. For all the categories, satisfaction was slightly lower in the city of Los Angeles as opposed to other areas of the county. The highest rankings we received were in the categories of neighborhood quality, healthcare, and ethnic and race relations. Jobs, the economy, and cost of living were rated the most negative. That is a theme that you'll see throughout this data, and one clear, huge outcome of this result was that in LA County and LA City now, there is clearly an economic cost of living focal point of people where they feel most stretched, most concerned, and clearly receive the lowest ratings of the other, all the categories that we tested here. There were substantial and profound differences between ethnic groups when it came to the general category of economic distress. 1 in 10 white respondents say that they've recently worried about going hungry in the last few years. More than 4 in 10 Latinos have experienced that fear, and a similar number of Latinos have worried about becoming homeless. There's a huge difference from an analytical, statistical standpoint. People that we look at polls all the time, that kind of difference is substantial. And many of these results, particularly those concerning financial cost of living, economic fairness, reveal clear differences by class, often exceeding those even that we found in terms of race or ethnicity. So just to again show that the overall score was a 59, you can see on the way a 1 to 10 scale works when you put it over to 10 to 100, 55 is the midpoint, we're slightly above that. Continue on. You can see the categories here, positive, more neutral, more negative. The 3 positive categories on the right, your own neighborhood, healthcare, and racial and ethnic relations. Also one question about religion in there as well. The more neutral categories, which were all pretty good but not quite as high, included public safety, the environment, transportation, which was the lowest of that group, and then the more negative are education, jobs, the economy, and cost of living. If we move on to education, the specific aspects of education, you can see here, went from a fairly high score for access to higher education down to more middling scores on the choices of K-12 schools, overall quality of K-12 public education, and then the training children and young adults receive for jobs of the future, slightly lower, and the lowest score concerned the level of funding. Again, they're rating their own satisfaction with these categories, not some assumption of what everybody else thinks. How do you feel about it? The level of funding for K-12 public education in LA County had the lowest of these satisfaction scores. The importance on the side, they assigned the most importance to the quality of K-12 education, followed by the access to higher education or community college, but that's education. The differences between the city of LA and the county as a whole on education were almost non-existent. As you can see, you've got here the county numbers are on the top and for each of these categories, and the city are below, and in no case was there a difference of more than 1 point. So the overall satisfaction essentially mirrors the county in the city. Latinos and Asian Americans, Asian Pacific Islanders, were more likely to be satisfied with the quality of public education. As you can see on the overall quality of K through 12 public education, Latinos and Asians are both at a 60. Whites and African Americans are each significantly lower at a 53 or 54 in this case. And also, when you also assign level of education that our respondents had, you can see a significant difference here as well, and perhaps counterintuitive. You can see the higher scores coming from less educated residents of the county, high school grads or less. They are over 60. The lowest scores in terms of overall quality of K through 12 public education are coming from college grads or post-grads, which are down near 50. And geographically, some of these subsamples are a little bit low, and we want to be a little careful at assigning too much importance, but interesting that the west side is consistent with that last finding. The west side is the lowest of all the geographic areas in terms of the rating of quality of K through 12 public education. The highest are San Fernando Valley, South Bay cities, San Gabriel Valley actually at 60. Cost of living, another category that received fairly low scores. And you can see here, number one, that look at the importance scale was dominant. 41% said it is the most important of these specific aspects is what they pay for housing, mortgages, or rent. So housing is the top concern, and housing also is the second lowest score here of an overall 51, with only what you pay in taxes being lower. All these scores were fairly low compared to a lot of the other measures in this survey. What you pay for transportation, slightly better than housing. Basic utilities, about the same. Even food and basic household goods still get only kind of a middling score at 56%. But housing gets a low score and a high level of importance. LA City residents, again, are about the same as the county on all these measures. In no case is there a difference of more than 1 or 2 points on each of the measures, the attitudes in the city mirroring that of the county. Go to the next one. All income groups are not satisfied with the cost of housing. The lowest income groups, under 60,000, are the lowest on this score. And then again, the ethnic difference of Latinos. Clearly the lowest rating for satisfaction of housing come from Latinos at only 47%, or 47, a score of 47. We referred earlier to the questions about hunger and homelessness, and these were separate from the index itself, but questions that we asked in the survey. We had an instinct, and frankly, Supervisor Yaroslavsky was the one that was most, I think, intrigued by this possibility, and the data was pretty stunning. Number one, that in the last few years, in the county as a whole, almost 30% say they have worried about they or their family going hungry because they could not afford the cost of food, and 31% of the county as a whole saying they have worried about losing their home and becoming homeless in the last few years.
Mr. Speaker, 1 second. Mr. Herman, I mean, I think this is like your 4th or 5th time. I tried to ignore it, but if you could please refrain from interrupting the meeting. I mean, there's a lot of people in the audience who are trying to pay attention, so if you could please refrain. I mean, this is your first official warning, but you've interrupted the meeting about several times.
Mr. Chair, on that note, he's wandered around, he's thrown his voice, mimicking people, he's throwing things around in the chair, he's applauding, and he's actually making our speakers uncomfortable because I can see it. So thank you for mentioning this, and that kind of behavior is not acceptable. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Farrell. For the record, could reflect that. Oh, and for the record, Councilmember Joe Buscaino has joined our meeting.
Good morning, Councilmember. In the city, the concern on both of these measures actually slightly higher, 31% as opposed to 29% in the entire county, worried that they or their family could be going hungry in the last few years because they couldn't afford the cost of food. And on homelessness, again, slight difference, but still 1 point higher at 32%. So almost a third of city residents say that they've worried about either going hungry or becoming homeless in the last few years. When you look at it by income, you see a dramatic difference. On the lower income categories on hunger, people that earn less than $30,000 a year, it's split evenly with basically half of them saying they've worried about being hungry, they or their family. about a third of those in the $30,000 to $60,000 range. Then it drops off as you go into middle and upper income categories. Latinos are, again, by far.
Can I just
Yes,
interject?
sir.
Go back to the last slide. I want to just point this out because it's most of this is intuitive. Look at the category $60,000 to $90,000 a year. 1 out of 4 people in this county who earn between $60,000 and $90,000 a year have an anxiety about going homeless, losing their home and going homeless. That's, to me, was a particularly of a stunning result. This was the most stunning of all. It's explainable, but it still was stunning.
Okay. And then Latinos, 44%. This is a dramatic difference from every other group in the poll, from ethnic group, have worried about being hungry in the last few years, almost half. You can see among men overall, they are more likely to be worried about going hungry, 33% to 25% among women. And then real quick on this, on homelessness. By the way, with Latino men, it was over half of Latino men had worried about going hunger. Homelessness, and as the supervisor indicated, look at these numbers. Yes, it's very high, under $30,000 a year, over half the people saying they've worried about being homeless, which is tragic. But even as you go into middle to upper, what we would call upper middle income categories, look at the $90,000 to $120,000 a year, and a quarter of them say they've worried about going homeless in the last few years.
This is what I was referring to.
Yeah.
It's the future slide, not the last.
Yeah, but the point well taken. And then on the next slide, for working people, these are not people on fixed income. These are people who are scrounging for a job that pays them less than $30,000, and almost 60% say they're worried about going homeless. Renters, which is the next one, almost half say they've worried about going homeless, 44% of renters. So these are significant and surprising in some ways pieces of data. Just real quick, the last few, these are more positive scores. Neighborhood quality, receiving overall a 71 on our scale, one of the highest scores. You can see the availability of fresh, nutritious groceries near your home, which is certainly a health issue. People are very satisfied. 75, the overall physical condition and quality of your neighborhood. And those were the two that were named by far as the most important. That also received a pretty high score. The only thing that was a little bit lower but still more positive was rate of growth and development near your home. And then when you look at it city versus county, again, almost no difference. The city results are almost exactly the same as the county. They're slightly lower, but just a point or two in most of these categories. And then healthcare also was one of our more positive categories. And you can see here that, the two that were the most important in people's minds, your access to medical care when you need it, received the highest satisfaction score of 75. The quality of health care you or your immediate family received the second highest at 73. Again, these are pretty high scores. Only the amount that people pay for health care was under a 70, but that was still a more positive result at 66. And again, comparing county to city, it's one of those things where the city and the county, again, are lining up almost exactly the same on this score as well. There is a big income difference on health care. You can see those that are in the higher income categories are very satisfied. They're in the 80s or close to 80. It does drop down into the low 70s or under 70 as you get to middle or lower income categories. And also age. The least satisfied people on health care are those that are under 40. The most satisfied are the elderly over 65. And then the last couple of, just to show the overall satisfaction index, you can see there is an income difference. That's pretty straight line, clear cut. People who are upper income more satisfied, people who are lower income are a little bit less satisfied. Not a huge difference, but a significant difference. And then finally, geographically, you can see this is the entire county now. Overall, the scores all cluster around 60. They're slightly lower in central LA, slightly higher in Malibu and in the North County and in the South Bay. San Gabriel also, but again, basically clustering around 60. And we're happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you so very much. Well, a lot of questions, and I know my colleagues have questions too, but actually we have quorum now, and Councilman O'Farrell has to leave by 9:40. So if I could just have you guys remaining there, and items.
Reconsider?
Yeah, well, actually, I do have a public comment card that I have to take up. So could I just get one of you guys to just vacate one seat? Everyone else could just stay. Mr. Herman, you have speaker cards on every single item, including public comment. So.
What does that mean?
Yeah. Well, I'm just going to.
What does it mean?
So I'm going to give you 3 minutes for all your items.
All right, fuck it. Mental health. You heard the statistics from this committee this morning. Mr. Zaviak is aware that Los Angeles is really fucked up, creating an issue of homelessness for a population of non-disabled and disabled people here in our city. And by the way, Mr. O'Farrell, don't fucking say I'm throwing furniture when I'm not.
You're so eloquent. It's just lovely to hear you speak.
That's right, because God says in the Bible, God
We can
hates,
each other and take
God
your
hates
voting, but
people
like-
who interrupt other speakers. God hates. But the Bible's very clear in Sodom and Gomorrah when God destroyed that city.
You can focus on the items at hand. Mr.
May I
Herman.
go back now? Thank you. Don't interrupt. Brown Act. So the issue here has to do what I'm doing. It's speaking my mind. Why? Because most people are afraid of you. The same way you use scare tactics to scare us from meetings. It's called perjury, false arrest. Stop putting us in positions to feel afraid and threatened, as I have been threatened by Jose Huizar in a club meeting when I'm talking about housing, what you talked about this morning. It impacts my life, homeless since 2008, and no fucking help from anyone. And when I was out in Van Nuys last night, Mr. Sharp in the background right there closed the meeting and didn't allow us general fucking public comment. You don't have to have a quorum for that.
If you could stick to the topic at hand again.
And so, going on item number 4, HIV. When I worked at County USC, I saw many HIV patients die. I wrapped them up in bags and took their dumb asses down to the second morgue floor. It's pathetic. We encourage more sex. We encourage transgender. Quit the bullshit. Respect God's rules. Sodom and Gomorrah, when he sent the angels to rescue Lot and his family, and he said, leave now and don't look back, bitch. And his wife became a pillar of salt because she was more worried about all her financial gain in this fucked up world I'm living in. And so the other issue on item 3, as I close off my last 34, 33, 32 seconds, is this. Communication from the mayor and the city administration officer to report relative to a request from the Los Angeles Department of Aging Authority to execute a contract with critical, significant technologies to provide emergency alert response system. Well, I, being homeless, have not received that response, and many other people. Do something about Obamacare. Provide us better mental health care. Stop fucking with people who are homeless and living on the sidewalks and what you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Supervisor, and thank you, presenters, for understanding. I mean, it's our First Amendment rights that, Supervisor, that you very much well fought for along with the rest of us. So, thank you so much for entertaining that. And seeing there is no other public comment, we'll be closing public comment. And with quorum here, if we could take item 2, 3, and 4. On consent, unless members?
Move the items.
Okay. Councilmember Buscaino moves and O'Farrell seconds. So moved. Thank you so much for that. And if we could go back to the presentation, and because Councilmember O'Farrell has to leave, the Chair would like to recognize you first if you have any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one question. This is a great report. Thank you for your comprehensive look at this. It's a great snapshot of where we are on all these criteria. Question, was public safety ever considered as one of the criteria to measure in relation to quality of life? And could you expand on that?
Yeah, absolutely. It was one of the 9, and we didn't focus on it as much today in this presentation, but it fell into our, which tier, Adam? In the middle, in the middle of the 9 categories, and with a 64 score. So, you know, the best way to characterize it is that it's still a significant concern to people, but it is generally a little more positive in people's assessment than maybe one would have thought. But it was definitely one of the 9 categories, and I think would be forever. I mean, it's.
And I would imagine as we dial down further, it would depend on which neighborhood or which area of the county or city, and that score would vary pretty greatly. But
Yes.
it seems as though by this snapshot, it's fairly consistent with the other measurements. It'd be interesting to break it down in categories in terms of Latinos.
Right. The Latinos,
demographics and
as we noted, particularly on the economic measures, the Latino differences and the story in the Latino community was stark. I mean, it was substantially different than others. My sense of public safety is that the differences weren't as large there, but certainly something we can follow up on with you. So.
On the public safety, I picked up the slide. On the issue of safety from violent crime, the overall rating was 64, but it was also the most important of the 4 subcategories that we had. 41% of the people that we surveyed said that violent crime was their number 1 concern. Safety from earthquakes, brush fires, forest floods, and other natural disasters, also a rating of 64. Safety from terrorism or mass shootings, 64. And your safety from property crimes, 64. And by ethnic group or racial group, whites rated the overall public safety category, the violent crime category is a 70. Asian Pacific Islanders, 63. Latinos, 61, and African Americans, 60. So there's a considerable divergence between African Americans and Latinos on the one hand and whites on the other. Actually, African Americans, Latinos, and APIs on the one hand and whites on the other. But noteworthy, even in the among African American respondents, they were 1 point above the overall countywide rating. So relative to everything else, it was a
little more positive.
A little more
right,
positive.
yeah, and a little surprising perhaps, but in the overall context, maybe not so much as far as the focus of the last several years.
Understand.
Thank you.
Councilman, we can provide more details, but you're on the mark as well in terms of the regional differences when it comes to particularly violent crime. The satisfaction levels in the city are pretty far below St. Gabriel Valley, West Side, some of the other areas.
Right.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman O'Farrell. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to go to the biggest question while I have Supervisor Xavier Oslovsky here, and so we can maybe have a little bit of dialogue when Councilmember O'Farrell is here. But based on your findings, first off, this reaffirms what we already know, and this shows us that we're working on the right track in homelessness, housing, economic development, jobs. These are all the biggest concerns. How does this play into, recently, not just local governments, local city, county, state, we're all talking about various bond measures, various taxes to combat a lot of these big target items. What are your thoughts on that? Because obviously there's a transportation tax, R2, there's trying to reformulate the Mental Health Services Act that the state's trying to do, talking about bond measures to help with housing again. But at the same time, it seems like it's a lot of taxes and a lot of bonds.
Well, I'll give you my political, rhetorical response, and then Paul can tell you what the real answer is. You may have noticed in the PowerPoint that the level of taxes, was it, you know what slide that is?
Yeah, right there. Satisfaction of 46.
Yeah. So I think that speaks for itself, relatively speaking. Overall, look, One of the things I learned in 40 years sitting where you're sitting or related places is the public is not as dumb as most political people think they are. They're actually pretty shrewd, and they have pretty good instincts. And with information dissemination being what it is, they even are able to inform their instincts a little better than they used to. People are going to make they're going to prioritize. There are going to be potentially a multitude of funding measures on the ballot, and they're going to prioritize. I'll give you an example. In 2002, we had two countywide measures on the ballot. One was the trauma tax. It's the first and only property tax that was ever approved by more than two-thirds of the voters in L.A. County since Prop 13. But it was approved, and it was approved overwhelmingly. On that same ballot, we had a countywide measure, a bond measure for seismic upgrades of the county's cultural institutions, the Music Center, the Museum of Natural History and Exposition Park, et cetera. People voted 73.8% for the trauma tax and 62% for the seismic bond. The seismic bond failed because it required two-thirds. So, and I sponsored both of them, and my conclusion was that people made the right decision. If you have to choose between trauma care and emergency room services and seismic upgrades of museums, I'd go with the trauma care every time. So people are going to make those kinds of decisions when they go into the ballot box. I know that my friends in the public opinion research business have argued that, based on their findings, that there's not going to be a lot of voter fatigue. That maybe no voter. I know that some of the surveys that you've been presented, that the city has commissioned, said no voter fatigue. I don't think you can replicate voter fatigue in a 20-minute poll. There's going to be tens of millions of dollars of ads on Prop 30, on Metro, on whatever number of homeless measures there are going to be, and I think you have to anticipate that there's going to be some voter fatigue. I'd certainly be prepared for it, and so be prepared that people are going to prioritize and say, that park bond, maybe not this year. Homeless, maybe. Transportation, maybe. Or maybe it'll be homeless, and I can live without another half-cent sales tax on transportation. We don't know. That's what the information, that's what the campaigns are going to be all about. But I'm generally pessimistic about these things by design. That way I'm not so disappointed when things don't turn out well. And I keep an eye on that. But now...
Well, so Mr. Maslin, before you, I'd love to hear your analysis, but it's what you said, Supervisor. I mean, before the two measures that you had, trauma tax versus earthquake retrofitting, but now we have all your top high priorities that your survey identified: transportation, housing, homelessness. I mean, there are
education.
We have a bond for. We have something for every single one of those. Yeah. So how does a voter prioritize, or what is going to be voter fatigue, or is there not going to be any?
Well, I both agree and slightly disagree with what the supervisor said. I think that the point I agree at is that it's probably hard to know in June, and it's hard to replicate the actual impact of a ballot of voters that, as you know, some voters will only start. To many voters, these are still just imaginary things. They haven't even heard about them yet until real campaigns begin and people get into that mindset in the fall. The people who vote early as opposed to those who vote late, as we know, there are differences there, and there may be no way to replicate the actual way the ballot's going to play out. Having said that, though, where I have a slight disagreement, I'm a little bit more optimistic, because I do think that the core that you just absolutely put your finger on, we see in this survey. And L.A. County is one snapshot. Obviously, there are other regions and other parts of the state that are going to matter. But when you think about transportation, if it's metro, if you think about homeless, which is a growing concern and people now responding to institutionally, when you think about education, which is an ongoing concern in which the level of funding was rated lowest, of generally some decent scores for education, but the lowest ones, or mediocre scores is a better way to put it, but the lowest ones concern funding, and we have a bond measure and we have a Prop 30 extension measure on the ballot. I think each of those areas are fairly strong right now, and unless there is something, and I don't want to analyze each of the measures, but unless there's something inherently flawed in one of those measures that causes voters to sort of say, not now, I can wait, as we know in ballot measure campaigns, when people sort of get confused or a little bit sort of unclear about something, they know they can always push things to another ballot and another year. Unless there's something like that, I think these are all pretty strong measures. I think the public general feeling in California is to still do something. We feel like our budget got handled well at the state level. We're not in dire straits. We can afford to make some steps in these directions, and you can see in the data that there's clearly, at least at a county level, there's clearly support here. So watch out. It could still hit a tipping point where people back away from one or two of these things, but as of now, there's still a pretty good foundation.
And I would just add, I don't think we really disagree. My pessimism is based on the fact that these require 2/3 of a vote.
And that's hard.
And I like to describe the metaphor for this as running a marathon. I don't know if any of you are marathoners, but I remember my first marathon, I overheard a guy next to me saying to his wife, "Remember, honey, play the 20-mile mark for the halfway point." And 62, 63% is kind of the halfway point. Getting the last 4 or 5%, that's where it gets tough. So it's drawing to an inside straight, to use another metaphor, and so it's difficult. The other thing I would say, since I've got two accomplished public servants here, it's critical that if you're going to go ask the people for money, that you tell them what it's going to be used for, that it not be an open-ended thing which will be up to you to decide later. People want to know what it is when I vote for a half-cent sales tax, I vote for a parcel tax, I vote for a bond. What is it specifically going to go to? So when you talk about homelessness, there's no question there's support for doing something about homelessness. That's evident from, it can be inferred easily from this survey, but all of your surveys have said the same thing. But people want to know, okay, if we give you $250, $300 million a year, how are you going to spend it? Is it going to be another boondoggle like we had for the last 100 years in California, or are we actually going to get product out the door? I think it's really important that you fashion a plan that translates to the average voter. And the last thing I'll say is it depends on the tax, right? When you say a $2 billion bond, I think there was an article in the paper this morning, if I'm not mistaken, a $2 billion bond for homelessness, that's one thing. When you tell people it's going to cost you $40 additional a year in your property tax, the numbers plummet. And don't assume that will not be communicated in some fashion. I would always assume the worst case scenario. I do agree with Paul that I don't recall a period of time where there has been as much consensus as there is. The voter population has changed and has shifted. The demographics of the voters have shifted. And the potential for doing something is as great today as it's ever been in my public service career. I would just say don't blow it. Because if you end up doing something that doesn't produce results, you'll never get the voters on your back, on your side again. You'll have them on your back.
Well, thank you for those insights. I mean, these are, as we get closer to November, these are the questions that we're debating internally because, you know, individually on its own, transportation, on its own, homelessness, on its own housing, how could you say no? How could you say no to more funding to create or build more housing, do all these programs? But combined together, I'm very concerned. But more importantly, I'm really concerned because there's this huge momentum, especially for homelessness and all these issues that we're working on. I'm afraid that just because we passed that bond, I mean, you know how long it takes to build housing, homelessness, it doesn't matter how much money you have. I mean, of course, money matters. Of course, we need the resources, but we're not going to solve it overnight. And I'm afraid that if we do get these bonds or taxes passed and we don't deliver on the results, and several years later, 5 years later, 10 years later, we're still in the same situation, the voters are not going to give us a second chance or a third, fourth chance. So, I mean, these are struggles that we deal with. But, Councilman, I got some more questions, but I want to open up.
Just add a question, and thank you for this. You know, we come to work each and every day doing everything we can to improve the quality of life, not only within our respective districts, but across the city lines, and I appreciate this. I'm going to use this as a tool moving forward. Have we ever done such a poll in previous years? If so, how does this measure compared on previous years?
Yeah, in terms of the overall index, no, and that's the point that we're making is now we have a score, we have a standard, we have a foundation that everything can now be compared against. Obviously, there have been a variety of surveys about general public opinion within the county and the city, and the best way I can describe, I think, the impact of this survey is this, what has been sensed and talked about, I think we've now quantified, which is the shift away from, I mean, if you think about LA in the last 20 years, concerns about ethnic and race relations and public safety have dominated. The transportation is always a big issue here, and it still is in this survey. Nobody is discounting that. But the fact that what rose to the level of the highest salience and to some degree the lowest scores were concerns about cost of living and housing and homelessness and jobs and the economy, to me, is the message of this survey. That is a shift. Whether the shift has happened in the last 2 years, 5 years, 8 years, doesn't really matter. It's clearly occurred. And then the chairman is right to say, and the voters ultimately are going to hold all of you and all of us accountable to what are you doing about it? And are you changing it? But that's the big, I think, the big story that comes out of here. When we come back a year from now, if you ask us, but for anybody that's interested, we're now going to be able to compare on an annual basis how did 2016 compare to 2017 compared to 2016, and then go on from there.
Yeah, I appreciate the work. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, and I forgot to recognize earlier, we do have Mr. Matt Sharp, our Vice Chairman of our Health Commission, our newly formed Health Commission, in the audience. Thank you, Mr. Sharp, for being here. And I definitely love to follow up every year. We would love to have this a yearly annual occurrence where we get updates, and this is where we're going to actually start the metrics, Council Member, so we could make the comparison. Just two quick questions before we close. How are you planning to share this? Because most importantly, I mean, I would love for our state legislators to get a copy of this as well, and especially your educational part. Funding for K through 12 public education in Los Angeles schools is one of the lowest satisfaction, and I'm sure after-school programs probably is all lumped into there. And I'm sure LA's Best would love to get their hands on this survey, because I know the City Council pushed real hard with all the after-school programs, including LA's Best, to get some COLA adjustments for them. Unfortunately, yet again this year, it failed. It's something we're going to push again, but this would have been very, very useful to show our legislators, with both the Speaker and the Senate Pro Tem being from Los Angeles or LA County. So how do you plan to share?
Well, number one, Councilman Buscaino, before you came in, we had indicated this was the first in what will be an annual quality of life index. So, which gets right to the nub of what you were asking about, and I think it will have much more value in the ensuing years because of the point of reference from this first installment. The way we are going to communicate this is in multiple ways, through the press, through hearings such as this. We're making presentations by the way, this was partially funded by the UCLA Luskin School and partially funded by the California Endowment. They paid for half of this survey. So we're going to make a presentation to them. We're making presentations to various elected officials. The survey is available. Anybody who wants it can go on the UCLA Luskin website, or we'll be happy to send it to you. If you just give us your email address, we can electronically send it to you. And we've written articles. Matt Sharp convened a conference call as a result of the finding on hunger in this survey, bringing together the UCLA School of Public Health and other advocates for food security in the community, which will help disseminate more information and help inform public policy on that issue. The whole point of this, Councilman, Mr. Chairman, really emanated from one of my jogs in your district. When I asked myself the question, what is it that I would like to know about my town and my county? What are the questions that I'd like to ask? What is it that I don't know that I'm afraid to ask? You know, the gardener who mows my lawn every week, what's his life like? Does he have health insurance? How many jobs does he go to every day? When he leaves my house at 4 in the afternoon, how many more lawns does he have to mow? How many people live in his housing unit? Does he have a housing unit? Those kinds of questions that most of us who are in that top 5%, that includes just about everybody here, how do the rest of the people live? And in the hopes that this would inform public policymakers in a more, it would animate some of these questions. You said, that these confirm some of the things, many of the things, if not all of the things that we've been thinking about. Well, this confirmation in that question on hunger and the question on homelessness is stunning. I mean, what does it mean? It means that when you walk down the street outside of City Hall, nearly one out of three of those people have worried about going homeless in the last few years. There's an anxiety level among our populace that is palpable. We see it in the political campaigns that have been run this year. People say people are angry. I don't think they're angry. I think they're scared. And the anger that comes out is a manifestation of their fear. And even in that homeless statistic, $90,000 to $120,000 a year, what does that tell you? That 24% of those people have feared going homeless. It means that they're one layoff notice away from being out on their butts. Even people in that income category. So what we're trying to do here is obviously provide a robust research, and academics are going to use it for their purposes at UCLA and elsewhere. It's all public and it's all available. But my real hope is that it will animate folks like you and give you the tools with which to make informed public policy decisions on homelessness, for example, on hunger issues, for example. You guys are not as much involved in the hunger issues as in the human service side of things as the county is, but you are on the housing side. And so how do you intelligently inform yourself about what course you need to take? I think this will give you, this year and in the years ahead, that toolkit.
Well, I'm going to add another question. Well, Supervisor, in a quick minute, or Mr. Maslin, can you give us your explanation of that slide that you keep on referring to, slide 23, about those in the $90,000 to $120,000 income category that are concerned about becoming homeless?
In my mind, it's a reflection of just how difficult and expensive it is to live in LA. And people that in any other part of the country, certainly the vast majority, would be termed wealthy, which if you're making $100,000, I mean, you're even today in 2016 going to be viewed as pretty well off, are, as the supervisor indicated, they're one bad moment, they're one layoff, they're one setback, they are, living in essentially on the edge of knowing that they're strapped and stretched thin with their mortgage or their rent, and that it is not inconceivable if something went wrong that they're out on the street. And that to me it tells us that while the numbers are even more stark with the lower income in our society, with Latinos in particular, and that is something of great import to all of you. The fact that it even bleeds into what we would call the upper middle class tells us that this is much more of a shared concern and a significant countywide, citywide problem that's not going away. And it's sort of, I think, replaced some of the other things that we've been talking about in LA for decades. The concern of the cost of housing and specific implications of that on people's everyday lives, I think, has risen to a particular level of salience and importance. We've hit a tipping point on that issue, and don't think it's going away anytime soon. We all know the struggles that people have just to think. If you're young, if you're under 30, you think to yourself, if you're living in San Francisco or LA, how can I even have a house? Yeah. Is that even possible? And for many people, it's not. And so it's not surprising that a big chunk of them think, I could be homeless. It could be me.
Thank you. One last question. Your survey, you gave us, is there more in-depth breakdown of all of these numbers? Or?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yes.
Because that would be great if you could share that with us, especially on slide 26, availability of fresh, nutritious groceries near your home, satisfaction was 75. but I'd love to see a breakdown, because I'm sure in certain areas like South LA, it's probably much lower, right?
We have all of that, we can supply it to you, absolutely.
Okay, that'll be great to see.
Mr. Chairman, if you would get us, if there are specific things you would like, cross-tabulations on these, let us know, and we'll provide them to you immediately.
Great. And anything I could do, my committee or the city council could do to help promote the study, bring attention to it, please let us know. And again, thank you so much for this presentation. Thank you, Supervisor. I mean, you've been a leader in homelessness, especially with Project 50. Still remember that a long time ago, which expanded to Project 500 and Project 5000, and now it's the new model. But thank you so much, and thank you, Mr. Maslin. I mean, you guys, not that I fully believe in all polling, but it gives us a great, as in my own election, but it gives us a great indication of what the temperature and the climate is. So, and you guys are one of the best. You are renowned throughout the nation, and thank you so much for doing this. I love to see the cross tabulations on all these things. Love to especially see you guys again next year. But before that, if there's anything else we could do to further the discussion, almost all the hot priorities or all the concerns identified in this report is based out of my committee, Health, Mental Health, and Education. So thank you so much. And Mr. Buscaino, any? Okay.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for devoting an entire committee meeting to this. It's very helpful to the overall cause. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And with that, meeting is adjourned. Thank you.